Welcome, everyone, to Neurodiverse Leadership Toastmasters. We are a nonprofit. We empower our members to develop their leadership and communication skills, resulting in greater self-confidence and personal growth. Our club in particular focuses on how we can raise awareness, acceptance, and appreciation through advocacy. And we hope to celebrate what more we can achieve together when we learn to complement each other's gifts. And today is a special event where we have a panel where we're building upon our insights and our expertise, as well as our experience for learning how we can build a neuro-inclusive workplace using artificial intelligence. To maximize insights and breadth with depth from the complementary rules, let's introduce our panelists who are joining us.
Hi, everybody. My name is Jose Garcia. I have a background in HR. Before I got into HR, I tried to study engineering. I didn't, at the time, I thought I had no talent for engineering, but I didn't realize that C++ is the worst starting language for a beginning programmer. When I was 4 years old, I was diagnosed as mentally retarded because the autism spectrum didn't exist. And so I didn't know it at the time, but I happened to be neurodiverse in the classic context. And that's it for now. And if anyone has any questions to ask more, feel free to go into it. But I'll hand it off to Daniel to do his intro.
Okay, thank you, Jose. I'm Daniel Wendler. I'm a clinical psychologist, and I like to speak and write about autism, neurodiversity, things like that. I was diagnosed with Asperger's just before starting high school back in the early 2000s. And so, you can't get that anymore. So I like to tell people that I'm vintage. But yeah, I'm excited to be here and discuss.
Yeah, my name is Nathan Chung. I'm happy to be here today.
Given the power of technology to enhance and reimagine processes, I'm curious what you think is the promise of using AI to build a neuro-inclusive workplace in an ideal world where there are no issues, no constraints. In order to build a neuro-inclusive place, it has to start with hiring the right people or a diverse balance of people. Maybe Jose, do you want to share your insights?
So one of the beautiful things about AI is that, the nice thing about numbers is they don't lie. So under a perfect, if we have the right training data, that means that the AI would choose essentially the best candidate. There's actually been studies done where names were omitted hiring managers were chosen. And when the names were omitted because you had no idea who the person was, more often than not, minorities and often discriminated against seekers would actually be chosen for the jobs, or at least chosen for the interviews. So it's interesting that such a bias still exists in this day and age where the name, sometimes the address, the geographic location, inadvertently makes the company say, oh, this person's too far. Oh, this person won't make the cut. And because those biases still persist today. And a lot of times it's not intentional. It's just that's how the person feels subconsciously. And you can't help how you feel on a subconscious level. So that's definitely one of the interesting promises of AI, that it will allow us to make objective decisions where we might even have an objective AI saying, hey, you're overlooking this person that might actually be a really good fit for your role based on the data of past hires.
Given the background for Nathan, where you have software engineering as well as business, that is a unique combo for any workplace. And given you have a whole podcast on building neuro-inclusive workplaces, I'm curious, what do you see in the future for the potential?
All right. So right now, as is, there's AI is providing a lot of benefits. Like we are seeing things like captions created by AI, automation of administrative tasks, text to speech, and more. However, as history has shown us, when new technology comes out, it can be used to create or destroy, to help or to hurt. And overall, the jury is still out.
Definitely, the jury's still out for whether or not we can get this to work, but it seems like everyone is leaning towards seeing the potential of AI to try to make it work. An insight that's usually missing for when we build technology is that we fail to realize the people aspect who we're building it for. Dan, do you have anything that you'd like to add to this mix of the future?
I think it's exciting to think about technology and all that it can bring, but I think that it's important to mention, as you've said, that like technology is used by people, and we have to make cultural changes in our workplace, cultures in order for the technology to be used well. For instance, if we have an AI tool that maybe would help an autistic person, better communicate with a neurodivergent person. If there's stigma around using that tool, well, then the tool is not going to get used. Or if there is, as Jose said, if there is a hiring software that uses AI to kind of eliminate bias, but then somebody says, "Oh, I don't trust this. My bias is good. I'm going to make the decision myself." Then again, that tool is not going to help us. And so I think we got to work on it on both levels of both creating the tools that unlock the possibility, but also trying to make these cultural shifts such that people actually use the tools in the most positive ways.
For me, as a management consultant, we're constantly helping clients dream of the possibilities, how they can grow their organization with AI, whether it's reinventing, reshaping, or preparing them to be even more productive and democratizing all of that talent and technology. These are some of the things that we imagine for them and try to make happen in reality. But at the same time, we're also trying to figure out how that can be better for their workforce, where it's like saving them health issues or costs from doing so. If you design the workplace for them, maybe there's less stress. Maybe they bring out their best. Maybe they perform more efficiently, more effectively without trying to change themselves and fit in or blend and harm themselves in the process. With the limitations and adverse impacts potentially with technology, what might be some of the parallels of using artificial intelligence for building a neuroinclusive workforce?
Hi, this is Nathan. I'll give it a shot. So the AI is learning and is fast becoming a reflection of the world we live in today. For example, like when I ask AI to create a picture of a group of people, by default, it excludes people of different races and people with disabilities. It literally is a reflection of our world and our biases. That's a problem. It's a huge problem.
So you definitely hinted that there's definitely limitations in the data that we feed the machines. How can we get the right data or the balanced data where there's an inclusive mix of neurotypes, all types of variations in our brains, all types of potential talent?
All of this data collection ultimately turns into dollars on the part of organizations, right? Because if you want to collect data about neurodivergent people, whatever, you got to pay the money to source that data and to analyze it and things like that. And it's cheaper or easier to just go after more typical data generated by people with more typical experiences. So I think that it's going to be important to really make the business case for why training these models in an inclusive way is actually helpful, makes the models more powerful, more effective, because there's going to be some guy sitting there looking at a spreadsheet, and he's not going to want to spend more unless you can convince him that that's not just the right thing to do, but it's the smart thing to do from a business perspective.
And to add to that, I mean, what Nathan kind of alluded to, in software, you have this concept of garbage in, garbage out. So if the data is crap, the output can only be crap. One of the biggest limitations with the data is that a lot of the data that we use is, like what Daniel alluded to, is conventional sources. Look at healthcare. A lot of the data that we use for healthcare is from white men, because the hospitals that treated that had these organized systems of data often were in privileged areas, underserved areas, or hospitals with very poor funding. Very rarely, like, data was a luxury that they didn't really have, because a lot of times you'd have people coming in ad hoc, or they were too poor to afford healthcare, so they went to that hospital because they had nowhere else to go. And so when you have people coming in ad hoc, or just when they need something, it's not regular or recurring enough to generate a data profile or a chart. I mean, look at hospital records in general. Hospital records don't talk to each other. If you don't go to the same doctor, the same hospital, the hospital has no idea what your medical records are, unless they actually unless you tell them, "Oh, I have it at this place," and they request it, and then that doctor's office has to be compliant in providing that record. So generally speaking, what every healthcare institution does is they generate their own chart from scratch on your one or however many times you visit. And that's all because the process of getting the data and those records is more tedious than it's worth doing. So it's like, you know what, let's just do a fresh diagnosis. There's probably nothing in a medical chart. In most cases, that's fine. But if you have somebody with a chronic situation or a family thing that's passed on, that will be documented. You're not going to have that information. So it's definitely a challenge to getting it. And I think the other challenge too is that accessibility tends to be an afterthought in design. And that's not intentional. It's you want when you're designing something, especially for market purposes, you want to sell as many units as you can. If you have to design with accessibility first, then it's going to be more expensive to design. You have to build extra features that aren't going to be necessarily used. And so as a result, the price point might be higher and you may not sell as much as you want. It's one thing if you're Apple and you're selling a luxury product, but most of us don't have Apple's influence or funds or anything of that sort. So of course it makes sense to build as cheaply as you can and iterate from there. And so you can't blame accessibility being an afterthought. But for neuro-inclusive or any inclusivity for that matter, accessibility has to be one of the core principles in design. But the world is not ready for that yet. We would have to change, like what Daniel alluded to about a culture shift. We'd have to do a major culture shift in our design and technology and on R&D before we were really ready to embrace that.
Oh, and to add to it real quick, there's another impediment is fear, because like for example, in certain states, some police departments in certain states are proposing having a database of people who are autistic. That way, they can help identify people who are autistic. They can help better serve them. Problem is, how many of us are gonna trust having our information in the police database? So there's a lot of fear there of being even being identified by a system like that. Now imagine AI, it's even more terrifying. I just tried to throw that out there.
There's definitely parallels there. Having worked in healthcare for over 2 decades, personalization is definitely key in building any solution, especially around the user, the customer, the employee. And in particular, there's a lack of trust, especially in healthcare. What happens with your data? How is it used? Is it used by the insurers properly? Is it used by the employers properly? But at the same time, at least Silicon Valley, having spent 2 decades there, there's a lot of innovation that happens in part because there are different viewpoints in looking at the problem holistically and finding ways to solve that problem. And so sometimes that data that Dan said that can be considered expensive was actually found free, very resourcefully, because people think of different ways to get that data in a more novel approach, a more human-based approach or a relationship-based approach, or they find a technology approach to get that data, to be able to use social media or some other way to get the inputs that are needed. And it's that different way of thinking that helps out for a lot more innovation, where plenty of research has shown by enabling people to be more free in their thinking, whether it's sabbatical projects where they have the freedom to solve problems their own way, that has led to, for example, workplaces at Google or Genentech, leading to discoveries that they were not planning in their business pipeline or on their radar, but has led to very profitable products or very productive innovations inside their workplaces for employment productivity. Now, given the mixed results on the benefits of diversity, equity, and inclusion studies, what do you think are the keys to building a neuro-inclusive workplace using AI? If you could do it yourself, knowing all of these benefits, knowing all these constraints, how would you equip organizations to be more innovative, productive, and socially responsible to thrive and in these diverse and dynamic environments?
I think I jump in, right? We all probably know that classic quote of like, if you've met, one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. And so I don't think that there's a one size fits all of like, oh, in every organization for every individual, this is how AI can be helpful. I think it's more of what you're saying, Jenny, of like, we want to unlock kind of this creative, innovative thinking where people can kind of boldly look for solutions. And so I think that with AI, one of the things that's really cool with it is that it's very, you can play with it kind of very easily. Like you can put in a prompt, you can put in a query, you can see what comes out, you can try something completely new, and it doesn't take 5 hours to generate a new, it'll just give you something different. And so creating flexible tools that can be applied with human creativity to whatever the needs of the specific organization is, I think that's going to be the way to go.
I think to add to what Daniel was sharing, there's a couple of possibilities. Like if you think about from a training and development angle, being able to simulate experiences based on who you are as a person, especially if the data on you is specific enough and personalized enough to really get at what you're like, and then having different profiles of people. So that'll allow people to like navigate things like being able to simulate a hostile meeting, or even being able to simulate a meeting where there's like a group think, and overcome these cultural biases. Because sometimes, unfortunately, especially when it comes to innovation, it's not the merit of the idea, it's the merit of the person who said the idea. So if the AI can allow this person to overcome that bias by figuring out how to present their idea, for the merit of the idea itself, that's going to be a huge breakthrough in innovation, because it's no longer, oh, you're that SVP, or you're that senior level person, that so whatever you say must be great. It really would come down to the merit of the idea. If you have the AI saying, hey, this idea actually has real market potential, um, and then the person can navigate, or they can practice, pitching to a simulated panel and using that to prepare for a real presentation. And we've seen that in the training and development space for AI is huge. You have some companies that are partnering with Amazon and some other big names to figure this out. And so that's a huge opportunity for a big thing of embracing neuroinclusivity, where if people can have access to opportunities to build themselves and develop themselves, it doesn't matter. And I think what Daniel said about labeling, it's very easy to get, to fall into pitfalls with labels, but it's not just neuroinclusivity. We see this with generations, right? Like, oh, Gen Z is lazy, or the millennials are entitled, or the Gen Xers are like all like crazy protesters, and the boomers are all like old senile people that are like can't let go of the world. And yes, some people definitely live up to those stereotypes, but more often than not, those labels apply to the extroverts of those generations. They don't apply to the introverts or the ambiverts or the people that were just too silent. And they certainly don't take cultural perspectives, or like immigration, or growing up in certain cities, or experiencing trauma and things like that into account. So there's no way we can expect neurodiversity, which has even greater variations than generation or nationality, into a single model. Like the problem is there's no one size fits all. But one of the hopes with AI, which is what we have to be careful about, is we have to be careful that whatever we're using for our AI model isn't taken as gospel, as a one size fits all. There's always like the saying goes, every rule has an exception.
Oh, and to build on that, the best of all is to, as solutions are developed, make it so that you don't just benefit one demographic, like just people with autism. Make the solution to benefit everyone. I think that's the key.
I think, I mean, that gets at the idea of universal design, right? Like, if you build it to be more inclusive, everybody benefits. And that, I mean, it's not just like good in general, but it creates more buy-in, right? Because I think sometimes we try to build inclusivity or accessibility into organizations, and people are like, oh, I got all these problems of my own. Now you're asking me to do this extra thing. But then if we say, no, like this just makes it better for everybody. It's not like an extra thing. It's for you. It's for everybody in your audience already. It helps everybody. I think that's one of the big things that can cause people to be open and say yes to these changes.
It's funny that you say that, because when I looked up neuroinclusive in the Collins Dictionary, it's a word being proposed to basically create an environment that helps with flexibility, adaptability, supportiveness for neurodivergent people. And so sometimes in design for a small group of people in healthcare, like a niche population or scarcity, you end up not only looking at solutions for the extreme that are much more universal for everyone, because if it works for that extreme population, it works for the average or typical population, perhaps. That could be a different way approach if the goal is to start with one segment where you really understand their problems and their needs and their goals, and then scale it to almost every niche where it includes every persona, every segment of the population. But at the same time, recently we've also seen that the Supreme Court last year decided to end affirmative action in college admissions. that's led to some of the companies pulling out funding and cutting their diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives. In addition, based upon some of the mixed results of those studies, depending on how those studies were constructed and measured. How do you think this will impact those who are trying to build neuroinclusive workplaces using AI? Or how would you help compensate for that or change that or improve that so that we can achieve and actualize this world that we're trying to create where we can all show our authentic selves and be our most productive selves, but using technology to sort of put the blinders where we're not discriminated against or biased or prejudged a certain way based upon the way we look, the way we think, the way we behave.
I think I'll start there and give some context. Now, affirmative action, remember that it was originally passed in order to right the wrongs, right? We came from an era where we denied people on the basis of things like their skin color or their religion or their sexual orientation or other things that are now considered protected, the right to education. And many studies have shown that the higher an educational attainment is, the more, at least from a salary perspective, the more money that person or that family earns, and the more successful they are in the classic American dream, where they have a piece of property and able to live a good life. And so that's the main reason for affirmative action. But what we've noticed with affirmative action, this is why the Supreme Court decided to finally put an end to it, is that we were hurting other people in the process of trying to right the wrongs. And so we definitely need to come up with a new legislation or new process altogether that allows for because we still have discriminated, disadvantaged classes, but without causing more victims. Because the arguments for people that said let's end affirmative action is, if it's two wrongs don't make a right, and in a sense it's true. But it's also about making retribution or reparations to to the folks that it could make a difference in. And there are people that have benefited from affirmative action. But no, but we've seen it also used in horrible cases. Like, for example, since a lot of Chinese and Asians in general were really good academically, a lot of schools used affirmative action to deny Chinese access to education. You actually saw cases of Harvard, Columbia, and other top schools saying, "Oh, we've got our Asian quota filled up. Let's start doing it." And so, the clever Asians that were like half Asian, half something else, would check off the other box. They're white or they're Hispanic or whatever it was. And so it wasn't just the fact that it was white people; it was Asians as well. And Asians, because of the Dream Fellow Act or something from the 60s, a lot of the Asians who came at that time were really educated, so they pushed their kids to education, which is why the Asians are successful. It just happens to be a coincidence that they knew how to play the game better than the Americans did. But going back to the heart of the matter of going to how do we build a better process, it's not like companies aren't trying. I mean, Google might have ended their DEI, but Meta is actually committed to investing in their DEI. And you've got some companies that pride themselves on their DEI practices. For example, Equitable, which used to be AXA Equitable, was in 2022 or 2023 considered the best place for developmentally disabled people, which is actually, and they're a Fortune 500 insurance company. So if Equitable was able to get recognition from the Human Rights Index or whatever the organization that granted that award was, certainly other businesses are trying too. It's not like DEI is dead. It's just that historically the way we were doing it, of hiring people on the basis of their skin color and not focusing on their treatment or their equity, because we weren't really involving everyone else in that decision. We were just pushing it for the sake of metrics. But if we would focus on inclusivity first, and then, the natural byproduct is diversity. Because if everyone feels welcome, if everyone feels respected, you don't pay as much attention to to subtle differences, compared to you feel like you're treated based on how you look or how you act or how you carry yourself. Look at Toastmasters, has many women and many minorities in positions of leadership, at least on the volunteer level. Same thing with a lot of professional associations. And that's because it's a volunteer-oriented culture, right? People step up because they want to get involved. I'm not saying it's perfect, but it's a really good model and an approach on, just showing how good inclusivity really is for promoting diversity.
And to add to that, yeah, it is a very challenging time because DEI is literally under attack everywhere. Like, example, in many of the big tech companies, the DEI leaders and programs have been axed. It's sad and it's very depressing to see, and I don't think that's going to stop anytime soon, because a lot of people out there sadly are against DEI, and sadly the way the laws and legislations of this country is written, they are winning. That's a sad reality. That's why affirmative action is gone now.
Yeah, it is hard when somebody destroys something that's helpful just because they want to score some political points or whatever. I mean, I do think that there's, some DEI initiatives that, have not been implemented in a good way or in a helpful way or whatever. But it's like, I mean, if you found like a medical textbook from, the days where they would, bleed people to balance out the humors or whatever, you wouldn't look at that and say, oh, like this means that we should just give up on medicine and like stop trying to, to cure disease. You would say, oh, clearly there's always room to improve and grow and to learn how to do this better. And I think the same way with all these DEI efforts, I think there's a lot of good that's being done. I think that there's more good that could be done. And I think maintaining, like, instead of getting bogged down on, oh, here's this person that said this thing that wasn't quite right or whatever, say, well, let's just keep making it better, because the mission, the thing that we're trying to accomplish of having this inclusive society, and righting some of these structural wrongs, I mean, that's a very important mission. We don't want to give up on that.
It starts with the people first, and part of which is the organizations that I see the inclusivity most successful and most sustainable are the ones that are already neuroinclusive at the leadership level. Almost every company amplifies its leadership team at scale as it grows. And so if the inclusivity is not in the leadership team to begin with, you're kind of forcing that diversity after the fact or retroactively. And when you try to force it, whether it's due to a legal requirement, whether it's due to a marketing PR campaign or something, it's almost bound to have detrimental consequences or fail, in part because it's not embedded within the culture. It's not embedded within their business. It's not part of their core. It's more of like an after effect. How can we make sure that the inclusivity starts more at the top? There's some companies, I know Jose mentioned some of the bigger companies. There are smaller companies like Ultranauts is a startup that based out of MIT. 75% of their employees are actually neurodivergent, and they're leveraging each other's different talents to be as successful or productive as some of the Fortune companies. Is there a way where we can scale that model where the inclusivity starts within and the diversity is also within? And it's a natural one. It's not a forced one. It's a natural one that's needed for whatever purpose or objective you're trying to achieve, which raises that age-old dilemma of the question of like, how do you get that right balance? How much is there such thing as too much diversity? Is there such as too much inclusion or not enough? How does management know where that balance is? And how do you then train AI to also figure out where that balance is?
Well, ultimately, what gets measured gets done. So one of the reasons why diversity practices, by and large, had a hard time grasping it was because we measured diversity on the basis of, what we could notice: the skin color, the gender, what a person identified, whatever boxes they identified. We don't really have a good measurement for inclusion. If we did, inclusion, DEI wouldn't be in the precarious state that it's in. So one of the challenges that we have, and this is something that AI isn't going to solve, it's a data science as well as a people science issue, is we need a standard of measurement that can be at least scaled on how do you know if someone's really inclusive beyond the typical employee employee experience surveys. You've got things called best places to work for, which are a pretty good approximation. Like if a place is a good place to work for, chances are they're inclusive. But that doesn't always mean that it's always going to be that way. You could be a best place to work for, but if you're a homogenous group, you might be the best place to work for that particular group. So in the case of Ultranauts, if they happen to turn out that way or if it was intentional, that I actually don't know. That would be an interesting point of view. Did they intentionally get to that point, or did it happen to be that the people they hired happened to be of that group? Because unfortunately, in the case of Ultranauts, it's the exception, not the norm. To really replicate what Ultranauts has done, I don't even know if we could do that in a controlled laboratory setting. But in terms of what we could do in, to ensure neurodiversity, there are organizations that actually represent and train neurodiverse talent, like AHRC. There's a Spectrum organization that also represents Good Help and some other organizations, and they literally try to place neurodivergent developmentally disabled people into jobs, often at the entry level. And so if more organizations partnered with organizations that already work with and represent neurodivergent, neurally disadvantaged or things of that sort, it would be a very different equation. But, unfortunately, if you were to consider neurodivergent as a minority group, it'd actually be the largest minority group by far in our country, with over, I think, 67 million, which is basically 1/5 of our population today. So that's the biggest thing, is actively seeking out. There are organizations that work and partner to help neurodivergent people. Then the other thing that we can do also as organizations is, in terms of being inclusive, is just being open to what people care about. I mean, it's unfortunate, but a lot of, especially at the bigger company level, stocks are incentivized based on quarterly performance, because the average CEO tenure isn't a long game. It's like not even 2 years. And so if you've only got 2 years of tenure being a CEO at a major company, you want to show your shareholders, who can essentially vote you out at the next quarter, that you're making as much money as you can. So what you do is anything, you're looking at all these shortcuts instead of playing the long game. And so what we need to see more of is stop being obsessed with the metrics of revenue and stock performance and things like that, and more focus on what's good for people, what's good for our customers, what's good for the employees, what's good, because if people are supposed to be our greatest asset, why are they a liability or an expense instead of a true asset?
Well spoken from a HR human resources engineer, where human capital is your greatest asset for any organization. But speaking of which, you mentioned about the majority of people being neurodivergent, or perhaps research trying to show that. And I know one of our panelists, Dan, has an audiobook on the myth of normal. As a clinician, how do you see the research playing out, where it seems like with neuroplasticity, everyone's brain is bound to be wired differently, in part because genetics and nurture from your environment, your experiences, is going to shape you to think, learn, and behave differently. If we are able to accept our differences from a leadership standpoint or from a societal standpoint, technology is only as good as the people process that it enhances or automates or accelerates. And so, how can we start with the people first and changing that mindset, with you as a clinician, or your colleagues as thought leaders in paving that space?
Yeah, I appreciate you asking for my thoughts as a clinician. I also have some experience in marketing. So as a marketer, I appreciate you mentioning my audiobook, because I always enjoy if somebody goes and, types my name into Amazon or Audible and looks out what's there. But if we want this to be a sustainable change, I think that it really is about moving this into a universal kind of perspective. And I think that that's the real promise of neurodivergence, is kind of recognizing that, like, everybody's mind kind of functions in different ways. And it's not that some people's minds are better or worse. It's just that some people's minds, we've kind of decided as a society, that's sort of typical, and others are not typical. But that's artificial. That's arbitrary. Like I in my book, I give the example of, like, what would you think of somebody who said that they had spent thousands of dollars on stuffed animals? And the answer is, right now, you'd probably think, wow, that person's really weird. But if it was in the 90s during the Beanie Baby craze, you'd be like, oh yeah, of course. Like I did the same thing. Like, everybody's spending thousands of dollars on stuffed animals. And so our idea of what is normal, what is typical, what is okay, it's just arbitrary. It's just made up. It changes, from year to year. And if we can move away from that and instead move to this, I think, place of truth of, like, everybody's different in different ways. And rather than worrying about if your way of being different is quote unquote normal, we're just going to make sure that you have the resources you need to thrive as you are, and I'm going to have the resources I need to thrive as I am, and we're just going to work on that rather than categorizing people. I think that that's going to be the pathway forward.
It's interesting that you say that, in part because when I think of like babies and my parents who are senior citizens, 80s, their brains have evolved very differently. But throughout their aging process, we find a way to support them no matter what, without thinking them as any less of a human being. If only people could also treat everyone like that, where everyone's brain's going to evolve at a different pace. Why is it that suddenly we treat them differently and don't give them the support that they need? That's something that I wish we could solve, Holy Grail. I want to close with some insights or takeaways that you'd like to leave the attendees with and share for advancing the neurodiverse community on building a more neuroinclusive workplace, whether it's for their employer or their nonprofit or wherever they may be.
So real quick, my message is keep fighting, never stop fighting for change.
I think I'd build on what you're saying, Nathan, which is to say that every little bit counts, because I think sometimes organizations are like, oh, like this is too overwhelming, or we'd have to do too much, and so we might as well not even try. But even just like a very, very small initial step, even just being like, 1 hour training on neurodiversity, we're going to listen to a 20-minute podcast, we're going to make one change in our policies. Anything, even if it's very, very small, makes a real human difference, and it puts you on the pathway to even bigger changes down the road.
To build off of what Daniel and Nathan said, and this is going to come on the other end of the spectrum, we essentially need a cultural revolution. Because let's face it, we're still in the era where we associate neurodiversity or neurodivergence as a hindrance. And the reality is that most people who are neurodivergent at some point end up being some of the most accomplished people. If you look at Einstein, he was dyslexic, but he was considered retarded because they didn't understand that he just couldn't read. The man was brilliant at being able to perform some complex calculations that are on par with like a basic calculator. But nobody understood these things. Similar to John Nash, he was schizophrenic, but he developed the Nash equilibrium theory in economics, which is still very much used today. And so, if we recognize that everyone is a genius in their own capacity, we just don't understand what their genius is. The really nice quote from Einstein is, "If you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it's forever going to believe they're stupid." So there's some really good research from a guy named Gartner from Harvard. He's a psychologist. Puts out this theory of multiple intelligences, and it basically says that everyone has an intelligence or a set of intelligences they're gifted at. Mine so happens to be analytics as well as intrapersonal. But for the longest time though, I thought, because again, if I go on off that 4-year-old diagnosis of being mentally retarded, thankfully my mother, like Nathan said, keep fighting it. My mother fought that and said, no, he's not retarded. There's a story of a kid who was also diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome, and his mother was told, oh, there's no hope for him. Send him to like a special program or whatever. And she fought that, and she decided to homeschool him. And after taking him to a bunch of experiences, he ended up at a planetarium where he found a love for physics, and he graduated with his master's from the University of Waterloo at the age of 14 or 15 or something like that. So it really just goes to show that if we don't pay too much attention to labels, or we stop obsessing over labels, yes, they're convenient, but they're also a hindrance. And the challenge with AI is that AI is going to accelerate or even to further develop our dependency on labels because it's so convenient. So we should always take, as the saying goes, believe half of what you hear and none of what you see. Take everything with a grain of salt. Just because someone is labeled something doesn't mean that they can't fulfill it. I mean, going off of a spiritual reference, everybody is made in the image of the creator. And if the creator can do all things, and we've done a lot as humans, we've gone to the moon, we've proven that the earth is not flat. We've been able to, study things that we previously were like impossible to understand. What's to say that somebody who seems to be disabled or seems to be like helpless isn't going to be the solution to things that we're struggling with, like the solution to cancer, or possibly even being the person that solves like food insecurity or some other big issue that we're plagued with.
Well said from our panelists for how we can all advance the neurodiverse community. I want to give some time to our audience. If you have questions, feel free to raise your virtual hand. From Terry, can you tell me more about how we measure belonging and what metrics might you use?
So belonging can be measured in a variety of ways, and that's the challenge with inclusivity, is that it's a subjective measure, which means that it's all relative to what the person is going through. For example, somebody could be actually have a great job, but if their wife is divorcing them and suing them for alimony, it doesn't matter how great the job is or how supportive the boss is, they're going to be miserable. And so you can't, and so whenever there's like subjective influences that you can't control for, that's a measurement that's always going to be, it depends on the situation. So in the case of belonging, it's do you feel safe? Psychological safety is a really big factor in belonging. If you feel like you can't be yourself, you're not going to feel a sense of belonging. If you feel like everybody else is into rock and you're the only one that's into pop music, you might feel like, oh no, but I don't belong here. It could be something simple like everybody else is really into cosmetics and I am the only one that's really into hardcore, being straight, no makeup, no tattoos, nothing of that sort. Probably not going to belong to. If everyone else is Muslim and you're the only Christian, you're not going to belong. You're not going to feel like you belong. So psychological safety is one of the biggest factors. The other factor is your ability to feel respected. Do people listen to you? Do you feel like you can speak your mind clearly? As long as everyone's respectful and civil, is civil discourse something that can actually happen? Because the key for diversity is conflict has to be managed, and if you're a conflict avoidant person, that can be really hard for you, especially if it's people that feel like they have strong personalities or they have a booming voice. For a conflict avoidant person, those types of factors can be terrifying, even if that person doesn't mean that way. That's just how they come off. So that's the main thing about belonging is psychological safety. Can people feel like they can freely and open talk, and can conflict be managed in a way that's productive or constructive? Because if it is managed well, that's where you really benefit from diversity and all sorts. But if it's not managed well, it feels like the Jackie Robinson experience. If anyone's familiar with Jackie Robinson being the first black player in the Major League Baseball, he was attacked, he was ridiculed, he was criticized, and he had to endure it all for a year, also that other people could have the opportunity to play the sport.
I think the question was not so focused on how to manage it, but how to measure it. How do you quantify how do you quantify belonging? How do you quantify whether inclusion and diversity is being implemented in the organization? I think that's kind of what the question was. How do you measure it?
Yeah, so and that's what I was trying to hint at is those factors that I alluded to. You're asking people how they feel usually on a scale of 1 to 5 or whatever, a measurement scale, and their response is their indication. But there's a lot of the problem with any subjective measure is there could be factors that don't have anything to do with the organization that play that person's impact. Like if a person is conflict avoidant and conflict is is a necessary ingredient for innovation, they're gonna feel like they're gonna have a hard time fitting in.
Can AI be a more objective tool in measuring metrics of performance when it comes to people of autism versus people who don't have autism and helping out with employment?
I could jump in quickly, which is I think with AI, I think it could potentially, as we've been discussing, be able to measure things in a way that's more objective, remove some bias. However, I think with AI, the big challenge, which hasn't yet been solved, is this idea of hallucinations. So like if AI pulls in data or you ask it a question and it doesn't have the data and answer your question, maybe it just makes up an answer and it doesn't tell you that it's just making up the answer. And I'm sure that there's a lot of really smart engineers working on solutions to that. Maybe they'll figure that out. But I would say until that part is solved, I think that AI as sort of like the source of objective truth is going to be something that we maybe want to be very, very cautious about because we need to make sure that the models are not going to be hallucinating or otherwise falsifying data.
Also, about affirmative action, I think they should base it on situation. Like, are your parents educated when you're going to university, or how rich were you? What kind of economic background did you come from? I mean, they can measure that, and they can give you a boost in those two aspects to see what other advantages other people have that you might not have.
In terms of taking into account socioeconomic background, because in terms of like when people apply for FAFSA or federal aid, that is a factor, but that's after the admissions decision. Typically, it's not usually so after the school has made a decision on whether or not to admit the student. Now, sometimes it depends on the college. Some colleges do take liberty to take that into account because the idea of college is supposed to be advancing upward social mobility. So, but you'd see that more commonly in like state-funded schools, or the schools that are essentially set up by the state and local governments, like CUNY, SUNY, Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey, and other, University of Florida. They typically take that more into consideration because for them, that's essentially why they were set up as part of their charter. Private schools aren't as obligated to, but also private schools charge a fortune in comparison to state schools because the state schools bank on the state and federal funding and as well as the subsidies and they also have a lot of students relative to private schools, so they don't charge as much. In a lot of cases, you can get away debt free. Whereas the private schools, they rely more on the endowments from alumni or private donors or corporate partnerships, and also whatever they get from their research royalties. So they're not as concerned about upward social mobility. So that's one thing to take into account, is that it depends on the school's mission. Some schools like to pride themselves on upward social mobility, like CUNY and SUNY. Other schools, it's more about the achievements of the alumni. So that's why they kind of justify it, or their research costs, because research is very expensive. And so since the faculty and the materials that they need cost a lot of money, if they can't get like grants from NSF or other prominent foundations, the only choice they have is to raise tuition. Although the whole tuition being what it is another matter that we won't get into. But it ultimately comes down to how much the school itself cares about upward social mobility. A lot of them do, but a lot of them are more concerned about having distinguished alumni or appearing in prestigious journals. And because of that, they're not as concerned with things like the socioeconomic background.
Well, thanks so much for our panelists. I want to thank everyone, and hopefully we can continue the conversation offline through our social media. We just want to close with Neurodiverse Leadership Toastmasters was founded to grow more inclusive leaders, and it includes both neurodivergent and neurotypical adults, ranging from caregivers to executives who can advance their communities with a safe, supportive, and neuroinclusive setting with members from America to Australia. And we hope you join us in finding ways to raise awareness, acceptance, and appreciation through advocacy. And we look forward to celebrating what more we can achieve when we complement each other's gifts and differences. Let's give a hand for our panelists.
Thanks everybody for having me. It was a great discussion, and yeah, I got a paid panel later this week that I'm a little nervous about. So this was a great kind of dry run to help me feel a little more prepared. I dropped my LinkedIn in the chat in case anybody wants to stay connected. Nathan, I shot you a connection invite also. So yeah, sorry that I cannot stay longer, but I got a jet, so I'll see y'all.